It usually doesn't hit all at once. It arrives quietly. One day you wake up, open your phone, and see someone your age announcing something big. A promotion, a wedding, a new home, a milestone that feels adult and complete. You scroll past it, then another, and suddenly there's a tightness in your chest you can't explain. You don't feel jealous exactly. You feel late, like you missed a turn somewhere, like everyone else received a map and you're still trying to figure out which direction you're facing. This is what it feels like to believe you are behind in life. Not failing, not broken, just behind. And the most painful part is that no one can see it from the outside. You still show up, you still laugh at the right moments, you still say you're working on things. But inside, there's a quiet panic ticking away, asking the same question over and over again. What is wrong with me? Psychology has a word for this feeling, but it rarely captures how heavy it actually is. Because this isn't just comparison. This isn't just low confidence. This is a deep internal sense that time is moving faster for everyone else and slower for you. People who feel behind in life often carry an invisible clock in their head. Not a real one, a social one. A clock made of expectations, milestones, and unspoken deadlines. By this age, you should be here. By that age, you should have that. And when your life doesn't match the timeline, your mind doesn't respond with curiosity. It responds with judgment. What most people don't realize is that this feeling rarely comes from actual failure. It comes from internalized timelines that were never consciously chosen. Timelines absorbed from family, culture, social media, and stories we grew up watching. By the time we're adults, these timelines feel like facts instead of opinions. And once that belief settles in, your brain starts filtering reality through it. You don't just notice where you are, you notice where you aren't. You don't measure progress, you measure distance. Distance from where you think you should be. Psychologically, this creates something called temporal self-discrepancy. That's a complicated phrase for a very simple experience. The person you are today feels painfully out of sync with the person you thought you would be by now. And every day that gap feels wider, heavier, harder to ignore. People in this state often describe life as feeling stuck, even when they're technically moving. They're learning, working, surviving, improving in small ways, but none of it feels like it counts, because it doesn't match the imagined version of success they're holding themselves against. And here's the cruel part. The more behind you feel, the harder it becomes to move forward. Because feeling behind doesn't just hurt emotionally, it changes how your brain functions. When the mind believes it is failing a timeline, it enters a constant state of low-grade threat. Not panic, not fear you can name, just a persistent pressure in the background. This pressure narrows attention. It reduces creativity. It makes decisions feel heavier than they need to be. Suddenly, everything feels risky. Trying something new feels dangerous because what if it confirms you're already too late? Committing to a path feels terrifying because what if it's the wrong one and wastes even more time? Rest feels undeserved because you haven't earned it yet. So people freeze, not because they're lazy, not because they lack ambition, but because their nervous system is overloaded with the idea that time is running out. This is why so many people who feel behind also feel exhausted, even when their life doesn't look that demanding on the surface. They are constantly mentally rehearsing alternative lives. Lives where they started earlier, chose better, knew sooner, spoke up, took risks, didn't waste time. The brain doesn't experience these thoughts as imagination. It experiences them as loss. And grief, even imagined grief, is heavy. Another psychological layer that rarely gets talked about is how feeling behind often comes with a quiet sense of shame. Not loud shame, subtle shame. The kind that whispers instead of screams. The kind that makes you avoid questions like, "So what are you doing these days?" The kind that makes you downplay your own efforts because you assume they won't sound impressive enough. This shame isn't rooted in reality. It's rooted in comparison-based identity. When your sense of worth becomes tied to progress relative to others, your identity becomes fragile. You don't ask, "Am I growing?" You ask, am I growing fast enough compared to them? And comparison is a race with no finish line. Psychological research shows that humans are not built to compare themselves to hundreds or thousands of peers at once. For most of human history, comparison happened within small communities, a village, a family, a few dozen people. Today, your brain compares your private, unfinished life to everyone else's curated highlight reel. Your mind doesn't know the difference. It interprets constant upward comparison as evidence of inferiority. That's why feeling behind often comes with a distorted self-image. People begin to see themselves as fundamentally slower, less capable, or somehow defective. They start rewriting their personal story to explain why they haven't arrived yet. I'm just not disciplined. I'm bad at life. Everyone else figured it out except me. But these aren't insights. They're conclusions drawn from incomplete data. What's rarely acknowledged is that feeling behind is often a sign of delayed alignment, not delayed ability. Many people move slowly, not because they lack potential, but because they're trying to build a life that actually fits them. And fit takes time, especially in a world that rewards speed over depth. People who feel behind are often more reflective. They question paths instead of blindly following them. They think deeply before committing. They hesitate not because they're incapable, but because they're trying to avoid building a life they'll later have to escape from. But reflection doesn't look impressive on a timeline. There's no post for inner clarity, no celebration for choosing not to rush, no applause for outgrowing dreams that weren't yours. So from the outside, it looks like stagnation. From the inside, it's often quiet reconstruction. Another overlooked factor is emotional backlog. Many people who feel behind spent earlier parts of their life surviving rather than building. They were dealing with emotional stress, family pressure, instability, self-doubt, or environments that didn't support growth. While others were accumulating achievements, they were learning how to stay afloat. Psychologically, survival mode delays development. When your nervous system is focused on safety, long-term planning takes a back seat. This isn't a failure, it's a biological response. But later, when life finally becomes calmer, the comparison begins. You're safe now, the world says. So why aren't you ahead? Because safety came late, and healing takes time. People who feel behind often underestimate how much unseen work they've already done. Emotional maturity, self-awareness, resilience, empathy. These aren't visible milestones, but they shape the trajectory of a life more than any early achievement. Still, the mind doesn't reward invisible progress. It keeps asking for proof, and this is where the inner tension grows. You feel pressure to catch up, but you don't even know what that means anymore. Catch up to what? To whom? To which version of success? This confusion can lead to impulsive decisions, sudden career changes, rushed relationships, commitments made out of fear instead of alignment. Psychologically, this is called urgency-driven behavior. It's action fueled by anxiety, not clarity, and it rarely leads to peace. People who feel behind are often told to stop comparing or go at your own pace. These phrases sound comforting, but they don't address the real issue. Because the problem isn't comparison itself, the problem is identity being attached to speed. When speed becomes a measure of worth, slowing down feels like disappearing. So the work isn't to stop noticing others, it's to untangle your value from velocity. This requires a psychological shift that doesn't happen overnight. It starts with recognizing that life isn't a single linear track. It's a collection of different paths that intersect, pause, loop, and restart. Some people sprint early and slow later. Others wander before finding momentum. Some bloom quietly, then rapidly. The brain wants a straight line. Life rarely offers one. And here's something deeply important that most people never hear. Feeling behind does not mean you missed your chance. It means you're standing at a point where conscious choice matters more than momentum. People who move fast early often do so by following scripts. People who feel behind are often forced to write their own. That's harder, lonelier, but ultimately more honest. The discomfort you feel isn't proof of inadequacy. It's the tension of becoming aware. Awareness always arrives before change, and awareness is rarely comfortable. As adulthood deepens, the feeling of being behind doesn't stay abstract. It becomes more personal. It starts attaching itself to everyday moments. Birthdays feel heavier, conversations feel loaded, simple questions begin to carry weight they never had before. So, where are you in life? It sounds harmless, but to someone who feels behind, it lands like an audit. Their mind doesn't answer with facts. It answers with judgment. It scans everything they haven't done yet, everything they imagined would already be true by now. Psychologically, this is where time pressure turns into identity pressure. In your 20s and 30s especially, society quietly shifts the rules. Exploration is no longer admired the same way. Uncertainty becomes suspicious. You're expected to be established, or at least clearly on your way. When that doesn't happen, people don't always criticize you directly. They just stop asking follow-up questions, and silence can feel louder than judgment. This is why many people who feel behind begin to withdraw socially, even if they're naturally warm and thoughtful. They don't want to explain their life. They don't want to summarize complexity into something that sounds acceptable. They don't want to feel seen as unfinished, so they keep parts of themselves hidden. Over time, this creates a quiet split inside, the inner self that is still searching, still becoming, still unsure, and the outer self that tries to appear calm, functional, and fine. Maintaining that split takes energy, emotional energy, cognitive energy. That's why burnout often shows up in people who don't look overwhelmed. They aren't exhausted by work alone. They're exhausted by self-monitoring, by constantly editing their story, by carrying the fear that if they slow down or stop performing stability, they'll be exposed. Another psychological pattern that emerges is delayed permission. People who feel behind often postpone joy until they catch up. They tell themselves they'll relax once they're stable, happy once they're successful, confident once they've proven something. But the finish line keeps moving. This creates a life lived in preparation mode, always almost ready, always one step away from starting to live fully. Psychologically, this is dangerous because it conditions the brain to associate worth with future outcomes instead of present experience. You don't feel allowed to enjoy where you are. You don't feel allowed to celebrate small wins. You don't feel allowed to rest. And without rest, perspective shrinks. One of the most misunderstood aspects of feeling behind is how it affects motivation. From the outside, it can look like a lack of drive, but internally, it's often the opposite. There is too much pressure attached to every choice. When everything feels like it has to fix your life, nothing feels light enough to begin. So people procrastinate, they delay, they distract themselves, not because they don't care, but because caring feels overwhelming. Each decision feels like it carries the weight of lost time, and the fear of choosing wrong becomes paralyzing. This is where self-trust erodes. If you believe you're behind because you made poor choices before, it becomes harder to trust your choices now. You second-guess yourself constantly. You look for reassurance, you compare again, you hesitate. Psychology shows that confidence isn't built by always choosing correctly. It's built by seeing yourself recover from choices that didn't work. But people who feel behind often don't give themselves that grace. They treat every decision as if there's no room for error left, as if one wrong move will confirm everything they fear about themselves. This mindset quietly shrinks life. Relationships can also become complicated. When you feel behind, you may feel out of sync with friends who are hitting traditional milestones. Even when there's no resentment, there's distance. Conversations revolve around experiences you can't fully relate to yet, or maybe don't even want, but feel you should. So you listen, you nod, you support, and later you go home feeling strangely empty. Some people respond by rushing into relationships or commitments just to feel aligned again. Others pull away completely. Neither extreme brings peace because the root issue isn't timing, it's self-acceptance. Feeling behind often hides a deeper belief. I am only acceptable when I arrive. But arrival is an illusion. There is no permanent state where life suddenly feels finished and secure. Even people who seem ahead are quietly negotiating uncertainty, fear, and doubt. They just have different reference points. Research on life satisfaction shows something interesting. Happiness doesn't consistently increase with early achievement. In many cases, people who follow non-linear paths report deeper fulfillment later, once alignment catches up with effort. But society doesn't tell those stories often, because slow growth isn't dramatic. Delayed blooming doesn't trend well. Quiet resilience doesn't photograph easily. so the mind fills in the gaps with assumptions. Another important psychological truth is that feeling behind often intensifies when identity is underdeveloped. When you don't yet have a clear sense of what matters most to you, it's easy to borrow definitions of success from others, and borrowed definitions rarely fit well. This creates a constant sense of mismatch. You chase goals that don't energize you, then feel defective when they don't motivate you. You assume the problem is you, not the goal. But motivation isn't a moral trait, it's a signal. People who feel behind often ignore this signal because they're trying to outrun shame instead of listening to curiosity. They're motivated by fear of being left behind, not by genuine interest in where they're going. That kind of motivation burns fast and leaves emptiness behind. So what actually helps? Not affirmations, not pretending you're ahead, not forcing optimism. What helps is a slow psychological reframe of time itself. Instead of asking, how far behind am I? The question becomes, what season am I actually in? Some seasons are for building, some are for unlearning, some are for healing, some are for experimenting. Trying to harvest during a season of planting only creates frustration. When people finally allow themselves to see their life as cyclical instead of linear, something softens inside. The urgency eases, choices become lighter, movement becomes possible again. Another key shift is separating pace from purpose. You can move slowly and still be deeply aligned. You can move quickly and still be lost. Purpose isn't proven by speed, it's revealed through consistency over time. People who feel behind often underestimate how powerful small, sustained actions are when they're rooted in self-understanding instead of panic. This doesn't mean ignoring reality. It doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. It means choosing progress that respects your nervous system instead of overwhelming it. Even psychologically, the brain responds better to manageable steps than dramatic overhauls. Safety precedes growth. Clarity precedes commitment. And one of the most healing realizations is this: you are not behind life. You are in conversation with it. Your timeline reflects your questions, your values, your circumstances, and your inner work. It tells a story that can't be rushed without losing meaning. The feeling of being behind often fades not when life suddenly accelerates, but when self-compassion catches up with self-awareness. When you stop asking, why am I not there yet? And start asking, what am I learning here? Because learning doesn't show up on resumes, but it shapes every chapter that follows. Eventually, many people who once felt behind look back and realize something quietly powerful. The delay gave them depth. The uncertainty taught them discernment. The slow pace forced them to confront themselves instead of hiding behind momentum. They didn't miss life. They met it more honestly. And while that realization doesn't erase regret, it transforms it. Regret becomes information instead of punishment. The past becomes a teacher instead of a judge. If you feel behind right now, it doesn't mean you're late to life. It means you're standing at a threshold, a point where unconscious living is no longer enough, where borrowed timelines no longer satisfy, where your inner voice is asking for something real. That moment is uncomfortable, but it's also meaningful, because many people never question the path they're on. They just run, and wake up later wondering why they feel empty despite being on time. You are questioning now, and that matters, not because it makes you special, but because it makes your next steps intentional. Being behind isn't a permanent identity, it's a temporary perspective, one that often appears right before clarity, alignment, and a different kind of forward motion begins. Not louder, not faster, but truer. And sometimes that makes all the difference.